Thank you. I'm delighted to be talking about one of my favorite practices when working with organizations on improving their operations. And it's a slight tweak on focus group processes called group process mapping. So one of the questions that comes up a lot in organizations, and particularly in service organizations, I've done a lot of work with nonprofits that worked with vulnerable populations of one sort or another, particularly work with child welfare and juvenile justice systems, as well as substance abuse treatment, and some work with the elderly. And one of the things that comes up frequently when you talk to executives in these organizations about how things are going is a real concern about what gets called the frontline. What's happening directly with the clients, and what are the experiences in working directly with the caseworkers, nurses, the people that they are working with day to day. One of the things that significantly complicates and challenges this issue is that many times the people who are handling direct client engagement processes are significantly underpaid, often not provided with sufficient training or support for their own experiences and the trauma that they often experience being involved with populations that have experienced a great deal of trauma. And so many times you are working with populations of frontline employees that have been underpaid, undertrained, underserved, and often have very high caseloads, a lot of stress, and then are being asked to handle what can be very difficult and tricky, subtle engagements with people that have experienced a lot of challenges in their own lives. So the constant challenge that faces executives in many of these organizations is, how do I, as someone who is not directly engaging with clients and who is hopefully trying to address some of the issues that the frontline staff experience, but often is stuck within the system where frontline staff are experiencing all of these challenges. How do I get to a point where there is consistency in the kind of experience that clients of our program have? So there are 3 ways that this typically happens, that executives approach trying to make sure that practice at the level of the client is similar. The first is documentation. So if anyone has been in a large social service organization, you will be familiar with the extremely clunky computer systems that ask for extensive documentation of every time you talk to a client, what you talked about, what the follow-ups are. This is one of the major ways that public systems have approached trying to get to consistency, is saying, if they're not doing it, then they're not going to be able to document it. Therefore, documentation serves as a record that they're doing the things that they need to do with each client. Obviously, there are all kinds of issues and challenges with that. Falsification of documentation is a very real thing. Divergent quality, if you haven't built in quality control processes with your documentation, becomes a significant issue, sort of documentation by rote. This is often, many times when I've come into organizations and engaged in a group process mapping, they've been doing intensive documentation processes for 10 to 15 years, and they have stopped being effective in ensuring that there was any consistency in practice. Sometimes I'm not sure that they were ever effective, but some were. One of the places that more recently people have tended to look in terms of consistency is around metrics. So establishing, for instance, that new patients will be seen within 24 hours, and then everyone needing to track for any new patient that comes in when the first contact with them was. Obviously, this also has some challenges with potential falsification. A lot of that has to do with the structure of incentives and how metrics are handled. There's some fascinating research around New York City's implementation of metrics around crime and what that led to in terms of how it shifted the incentives for officers and some of the sort of perverse results that occurred. So in working with metrics as a way of approaching consistency, both the nature of the metrics and how they might be gamed, as well as how behavior on the part of frontline staff might shift in order to respond to the metrics, and whether those shifts would be desirable or not, all needs to go into the thinking about metrics. Sort of casually established metrics for consistency can sometimes create more havoc than they're worth. The third way, and you see this a lot, particularly in medical settings, is standard operating procedures, where everyone has a set of documented procedures that they need to do every step of the way. Sometimes it's a checklist where you actually need to be checking it off. This often goes together with documentation and/or metrics. It is framing documents, how intense different places are in terms of the extent to which they insist that people follow standard operating procedures, and the punishments if you don't vary significantly. There are some places, for instance, airline towers, where the consequences of not following standard operating procedures are so significant that missing a step will get you fired. Whereas many places, standard operating procedures are, if they're done at all, they're not particularly well followed, they're not particularly well taught, they're not particularly well enforced. When you talk about diverging from standard operating procedures, or how the leadership of the organization wants client engagement to go, divergence is a mixed bag. So the dominant thinking tends to be that if people are doing something different than what has been handed down, that's necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the very best practice is divergent from standard operating procedures when there's a good reason. So for instance, standard operating procedures in a juvenile justice context are built around the quote unquote typical youth that is coming in. A really good juvenile probation officer may have a sense that the standard process doesn't make sense for a particular youth, and they want to take a new approach within strong frameworks and structures for standard operating procedures, metrics, documentation. That human judgment is allowable as long as there's a good reason and there's some check of that judgment. In bad systems, the focus is, no, we are all trying to do exactly the same thing. So do not diverge for any reason whatsoever. But divergence can be a positive when you have skilled people that are trying to make a decision based on the particular circumstances. Divergence, of course, can also represent not doing the minimum standards. So it's really important to understand the idea of standard processes as the way that you want business as usual to go, with the recognition that circumstances will diverge, and you want to have a process where it makes sense in more extraordinary circumstances to diverge from standard operating procedures in ways that are beneficial to the individual clients, but to minimize divergence in ways that are serving the employees and not beneficial to the clients. And that's where having standard operating procedures, having ways to be able to track whether people are engaging in those, become really helpful as that sort of standard of solid practice. So group process mapping lands within this universe of challenge in frontline practice and the tension often on part of management around how to ensure that frontline practice is what they want it to be and what they are telling funders, their board, that it is. So group process mapping exists to unearth what is actually happening in frontline engagement with clients and to understand the diversity of practices that different workers are using to be able to identify positive divergence, identify problematic divergence, and create a structured process for whoever is making the decision. And in ideal process, it's really for the frontline workers and their managers to establish together what is the best process. And then that might be approved by management. But of course, sometimes you're working with systems that are a little more authoritarian, where the management then wants to take all of this information and say, this is the practice you should do. It doesn't work as well, but sometimes you get those kinds of clients. So what is group process mapping? In person, generally it involves a giant whiteboard, and every group's mapping all of the steps that happen from the first time that they see a client all the way until the end of their engagement. Here's a sample of what a process map tends to look like. Sticky notes are your friend. There are also some online tools for being able to do this. I haven't used them as extensively. I actually have just put in a bid for a new project where we will be doing group process mapping online. So I may do a follow-up where I can talk a little bit more about how do you do this process virtually, which I think is going to be a fascinating challenge. So we've talked about this a little bit. When you use group process mapping, I'm going to start with the bottom and say, it's a large time investment for the staff, and it's relatively expensive in terms of being able to engage with a qualified facilitator. So it's not something that groups should do casually, and it's not something that groups should do internally. It's really important to have an outside expert come in and do this with your team. But when there are significant concerns about practice, those can be throughout the organization. They don't have to be on the front lines, but generally how it has been expressed in a lot of my clients has been, what is the experience of clients? And so, well, much of that touches on the front lines. When you actually get into the process maps, of course, the frontline experience is dependent on a lot of other people. And so when you start to look at practice and the experience of clients, it ends up touching on the whole organization in a way that sometimes clients don't realize going in. They become sort of surprised to realize that actually decisions of the executive team are having a direct impact on the experience of clients. Concerns about consistency. And then thankfully, as one of the beneficial things about a lot of the awakening that has happened in this time around bias, is that this is a really useful tool if the organization is concerned about bias and outcomes. So, for instance, one of my clients had a strong sense that caseworkers may be doing a lot of interventions with people that they really liked and less interventions with people that they didn't. This absolutely is experienced in terms of racialized individuals, new immigrants. There are a lot of situations where if there is not a careful process, the individual experiences of clients can be very divergent in ways that reflect bias. So, how you actually do this. The first big question when you're doing group process mapping and you've decided, yes, we really want to understand what the experience is, what the process is for a client going through the intervention of this particular organization, and we want to invest in this process to do it. So if that's all settled, then the question of how to do it starts with, how do you want the different groups that are going to be doing the mapping together to be formed? And there are 3 different ways that I have done this, and then I'll talk about why one versus another. So the first is by function. So in larger organizations, you can have people that are specialized in different parts of the process. So for instance, within a juvenile justice system, there was a team that was responsible for intake, a separate team that was in charge of pre-court, I'm blanking on the Canadian term, pre-court incarceration of the youth in the juvenile jail. And then entirely separate team that handled the court process, and finally a team that handled the probation process. And so in order to look at the experience of a client of the system or a youth that was in the system from their very first experience with the system to the end of their experience with the system, you needed to be able to look at all of these different teams that had different functions. And so it made sense to, in that case, divide up the group process mapping by function and have each team really focus on their piece of the entire flow and what they understood coming in to their piece and what they understood as what they needed to have completed and handed off at the end of their piece. The second is by place in the hierarchy. I find this very useful when there is tension and very little understanding between those in senior management and those working directly with clients, as a way to be able to have those challenging conversations and help people to see the perspective of the other and the desires of the other in terms of what everyone wants practice to be. So you can divide groups up in, maybe you have several groups of caseworkers, a couple of groups of managers, a couple groups of senior managers. You might even, I've done this with some groups where I also have external stakeholders that form their own group and have sort of a view into the process. I've also done some process mapping with clients and their families. I would say that in general, that hasn't been the best use of time with them. Many times when I've done organizational assessments, there's been relatively little time with clients and their families. And I have found it more useful to ask them some questions in the interviewing about their experience of the process, rather than asking them to go through what's a relatively lengthy process of documenting every detail of the process, which sometimes they also rightly can't remember. And then finally, mixed groups. I find this really helpful when the major goal is to be able to just get people talking about process. So organizations that haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how they engage with clients, and you want that mix of perspectives and you want those conversations. And there's a facilitator who is highly confident about their ability to address real-time issues of power and authority in the room and be able to shut down the kinds of silencing or other challenges that come when you have mixed groups across hierarchies. If you have those things in place and you really want to facilitate the detailed conversation, mixed groups can totally work. I think you have to be careful with those. I would say the vast majority of the group process maps I've done have been by function, and some have been by place and hierarchy. I think I've done 2 mixed ones. So how do you do it? So with each subgroup, you ask them to map out in detail the process of working with a client. And the challenge here as the facilitator is the in detail. And so every time you think you've got enough detail, there's usually more to happen. So for instance, if they say, you know, the first thing is somebody shows up and I give them an intake form, you're going to want to know, how did they show up? What was their experience of showing up? You know, is there, do they have to have a car? Are there buses there? What, you know, is there a parking attendant that they deal with? What is that? And then, you know, they're coming into the building. Who are they seeing in the building? How are they getting to you? Okay, they're showing up at your desk. Now, you know, do you hand them the intake form first thing? Are there things that you say before? If so, what do you tend to say before? So the goal is to be able to get as specific as possible about the exact experience from the moment that they come into your system to the moment they leave. And then when there are things, for instance, I have them fill out an intake form, then you can trace that back and the process of, okay, where did that intake form come from? Who developed it? Why is it there? Does it work for you? Do you feel that the questions on the intake form allow you to be able to do the thing that you need to do next with the client? Okay, what is it you need to do next? So being able to lead the group pretty carefully through being able to define this. And groups kind of get excited about this. One of the challenges that can happen with some focus groups, if you don't have a really defined set of questions, is that they can go a little silent. Mapping is a really good process to get people to continue talking and to get people really excited. And so you often have, I tend to do this with groups of no more than 4. You have people really jumping in and talking about, oh no, I don't do it that way, or, you know, here's what I say. And so that can be really helpful, and that becomes really important to be able to document those disagreements and those divergences and methods, and get people to be as specific as possible about not only what is it that they do, but why. Why have they made the choice at this point in the process to approach something in a particular way? You know, we talked about the divergences that are beneficial to clients and done for very specific reasons, and then the divergences that maybe aren't so intentional or thought out. And so being able to understand the reasons behind divergence in practice becomes really important to being able to kind of unearth if there are judgments being made about, say, a particular client from the information that you have when they come in that's causing that divergence, or if it's, you know, something that someone learned from their mentor 30 years ago and it seemed really good and so they've just stuck with it. Being able to understand those reasons becomes really important as you're documenting the process, to be able to reflect on what might be areas where divergence does matter, and if so, what the criteria for divergence would be, and where it's just people having different practices and it would make total sense to have a single practice. It's also really important, I talked about defining expectations of other actors. So oftentimes, for instance, in initial intake, they might need the signature of a supervisor to be able to close out their part of a process. Caseworkers have expectations around how available the supervisors are, how fast that happens. Understanding those expectations and how well they feel those are met becomes really important, because you're having these conversations about the process with subgroups. You have the ability to be able to talk to one group about what they expect from another group and talk to the other group about what they're able to deliver, and be able to resolve some of these distinctions between expectations and delivery. And then to understand either any documented timelines and flows, or how these things actually function for people. So sometimes with groups, I have found it very helpful when we're starting to have the conversation that usually a client will suggest it. One of the caseworkers will be like, look, There's the process that we're supposed to do, and then there's the real process. And so sometimes with subgroups, we'll actually do two different maps. We'll do the sort of ideal map, and then we'll do the real map, and that can be really useful. Once you have worked with each of the subgroups, the goal is to bring all of those maps together and try to merge them and bring in as many of the places of divergence as you have been able to identify in the process. I find it really helpful to have a small group of caseworkers and managers and then the executive team to talk about these things before you present them to the large group, so that there's a better understanding of how the organization thinks about them, whether some of these in their minds are big deals, whether divergences really don't matter at all. Being able to kind of ground yourself in the significance of what you're seeing becomes really important. At that point, bring as many of the people who have been involved in the process together as possible to talk about the process, talk about where there's consistency, where there's divergence, to ask the group to take a look at points of divergence that are of concern and have a deep discussion about best practice. So oftentimes that happens as a follow-up process where there'll be a committee established for each area to really look at all of the different approaches and to think about what is best practice here. And then to the extent that we can figure those things out in the room at the follow-up conversation or over time, that all then goes into the best practice map. And the goal of group process mapping is that the best practice map represents the real experience of caseworkers and represents what they feel is important to accomplishing with clients. Because of this tension that often exists between upper management and frontline staff, processes like this that facilitate that conversation and ensure that caseworkers have a direct role in establishing what best practices and standard operating procedures are, that does a great deal to increase buy-in and reduce the threat of gaming of the system. It doesn't take away the need for documentation, metrics, continuous monitoring of standard operating procedures, but it does increase buy-in because everyone is engaged in the process. Follow-up. So we talked about sometimes there's follow-up in terms of actually establishing what the process that you would want on the map is. The group of employees that I tend to have kind of working with me on the assessment process, I will ask them to document each step in the map as more of a standard operating procedure so that we have it clarified exactly what the group thinks should be happening at each stage of the process. And then it's a matter of looking back at the existing documentation processes, that clunky computer system, the metrics and the standard operating procedures, and making any changes that you need to those systems so that they are lined up with the best practice system that you've established through the mapping. And then ideally, there's a client feedback process. This really depends on the flow of your clients and how long they are with you, whether this is something that they are aware of or not. For organizations that have had really bad outcomes in terms of being responsive to clients, client feedback can be a massive boost to the staff in terms of feeling really good about establishing new processes. So, for instance, I worked with a child welfare system that when they had a new child come in, they would do these family meetings to be able to talk with all of the people that cared about the child about what to do in the situation. And family meetings, back before we intervened, could happen, you know, 6, 8 weeks after the child was already in care. And so, you know, the child had already had a lot of experiences and a lot of time sometimes away from their family before this conversation about what would happen with the child would even occur. And so being able to, in that case, do the process mapping, get that timeline down significantly, and then do client feedback, talking about how important it was to them to not have such a huge time lag between the child entering care and them being involved in what was going to happen to the child. That just did a lot to boost the importance of frontline staff sticking with the process that had been agreed to. And as I said in the beginning, often frontline staff are underpaid, undertrained, and undersupported. And so one of the things that often comes from processes like these, when executives are asking different kinds of expectations around timelines, engagement with clients, the kinds of questions that are being asked, a lot of these underlying issues around the experiences of frontline staff come up through that process and become additional areas of follow-up that become important in terms of how do we address some of the underlying conditions that cause the negative client experiences that we all want to avoid, but that can really occur in the absence of strong structures and processes for engagement. So this is a relatively simple tweak on focus group work. It's just adding in a mapping process. But I think that in these contexts, it can be a completely game-changing kind of intervention and a very useful part of an assessment process when you're trying to understand the relationship of an organization to its clients. Thank you very much. If you have any questions or are interested in trying this method, feel free to reach out to me anytime. My email address is there, as well as our website for CRESS.
Thank you,